fancy technology, 3D modeling, discounted prices, your dreams, Fusion 360. It's bad for business.
I like to do drawing.
Okay, so now that we are caught up, today I am talking about selecting lumber and milling it so that I can actually start building something. I've gotten asked quite a few times about how I select and buy my lumber, and it's actually one of the most common questions I get from friends of mine that don't have any woodworking experience, which I always find kind of interesting because there isn't really much to how I buy lumber, but I'm gonna go over my process here for anyone that might be interested. Now, before I get into it, I will say there are a ton of terms and lingo when it comes to buying lumber. For example, this board could potentially be described as 8-quarter, select and better, kiln dried, flat sawn, hit and miss, white oak. So I'm not going to go into the specifics of that stuff. That could really be a video in itself. I'll definitely talk about the types that I bought. But if you want kind of a crash course into all things lumber, go check out William Walker's video he did a few months ago. It has pretty much everything you'll need to know when it comes to this stuff. I'll put a link to that in the description. Anyway, the first step in all of this is to figure out how much and what types of lumber I need. It's a logical first step, I know.
Duh.
And this is where having a 3D rendering comes in pretty handy. I'm able to go through all the individual parts and figure out dimensions and panel sizes, which I then just list out on a piece of paper. And I like to organize it by species of wood and the thickness. And this is because lumber yards are often organized in the same way. Another thing I decide at this point, which is kind of specific to this piece, is where I can utilize plywood. Now, I knew that I wanted most of this piece to be solid wood, but I knew I could make a large portion of the inner cabinet out of veneered plywood. This will just help decrease the amount of time spent making panels, and the inside of the cabinet will more or less not be seen. So with everything listed out, I can now start adding up the total lengths and widths of all the panels. So for instance, with the main cabinet, I know I need 10 feet or 120 inches by about 18 inches wide. And since I know I won't be using one 18-inch wide board, once I get to the lumberyard and see what widths they have, I then just get as many boards as I need to make that full 18 inches. So in my case, I bought 4 10-foot long boards, and each one was between 5 and 6 inches wide. And now that I have all the material I need listed out, this is a good time to calculate how much it's all gonna cost, just to get a general idea. This is good if I'm working with a client, I can give them an idea, or if you need to call your bank and take out a loan or something. But here you'll need to convert everything to board feet, because that's how lumberyards will calculate the cost. Everything is priced per board foot. And if you can't remember the equation for board feet, you can just take a look at your shirt. Shirts are available on my website. I'll put a link in the description. Okay, let's go look at what I actually bought. So here I've got a couple boards of solid 5-quarter rough sawn walnut. And this is gonna be for the top of the cabinet, as well as there should be enough to make the cabinet doors. I also got one sheet of 3/4 inch walnut veneered plywood, and this is going to be used for the rest of the inner cabinet. And this sheet of plywood is actually considered shop grade, which basically means there's some defect on this sheet of plywood, but oftentimes it's minimal and easy to work around, and you can get the sheet of plywood at a discounted price. Here I have 8-quarter white oak that I'm going to use for the curved drawer fronts. And I basically just need a thick enough stock to create that curve. This board is also called hit and miss, which essentially means it's been skip planed so you can see a lot of the grain, but there are still areas that are rough sawn, and both the edges are still rough. This is a couple boards of 4-quarter white oak that I'm going to use for the base, and it's considered S3S, which means it's been surfaced on 3 of the sides. So I have 2 surfaced faces and then 1 straight edge. Boards like this often give you a nice starting point and can be a little easier to work with as not as much milling is needed. And finally, this is all 6/4 white oak, and this is going to be used for the main cabinet. And I've actually already milled all of this, which you'll see in a minute. But when I bought it, it was hit and miss lumber, so there are rough spots throughout the boards, as well as both edges being rough. So when actually picking out lumber, I think about a couple things besides just trying to get the proper length and dimensions. First is the look of the wood. Now, I'm not much of a grain freak. I don't worry too much about getting wild figured wood, but what I do worry about is picking out boards that have a consistent look to them, especially when I'm going to be gluing up bigger panels. I want each of those boards to be able to sit next to each other and almost look like they're one consistent piece of wood. I also take my time to select the straightest boards I can find. This is sometimes difficult, but if you take a little more time to get really straight boards, it'll save a ton of time, especially during the milling process. So now that I have almost everything I need, it's time to start milling it up and getting it ready to actually start building. And I'm going to use this 6/4 white oak that's going to be the main cabinet to illustrate my process. The very first step is to measure out and cut the boards to rough length. This just makes it easier to joint and plane each section rather than trying to do the entire board at once. I also like to use a jigsaw to cut rough lumber like this. It just feels a little safer, a little more controlled, at least for me. So now that I have my parts cut to rough length, I like to start the actual milling process. And I like to go in this order. Joint one face, then plane the opposite face, joint one edge, and then rip the opposite edge on the table saw. There isn't really much to this. It's just kind of a matter of keeping everything organized as you work through the steps. But it's at this point where I want to get everything to its final thickness. So in this case, I bought 6/4 hit and miss white oak, which is right around 1.5 inches thick. And once I finished the milling process, all these parts were right about 1.25 inches. And everything is nice and flat and ready to be glued up into panels. But I think that's where I'm going to stop for this video. I'm going to get going on actually starting to build this thing, hopefully get the main structure built, and that'll be the next video. So of course, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Hopefully it gave you a little bit of an insight into how I select lumber and get it ready to build with. And hopefully I can make some progress this week and get that next part out soon. Like I mentioned, links to everything are in the description. And of course, before we go, as usual, sometimes people say buying lumber can be confusing, but I think that's a joke. All you have to do is remember something like 8/4 select and better kiln dried flat sawn hit and miss white oak.